Hello, everyone. So my name is Sarah Brooks, and I'm the Marine Spatial Planning Specialist for the Bermuda Ocean Prosperity Programme. And today I will present a toolbox for modifying marine protected area design, or MPA design. So this talk is largely tailored to the participants of BOP's upcoming focus group sessions. And those participants are going to be tasked with making suggested modifications to the proposed MPA network as part of Bermuda's Marine Spatial Plan. And those modifications will attempt to address concerns raised by stakeholders during the recent public consultations. And this presentation is designed to give all the tools and information that those participants will need in order for them to carry out this task. So if you're a participant in one of these focus groups, then please bear this in mind. If you're watching this presentation as a member of the public, then I still think there's a lot of useful information you'll find in this. And if you're keen to know the outcomes of the focus group sessions, then please keep an eye on our website over the coming months, and we'll share those outcomes with you. Okay, so this is the proposed marine protected area network in the nearshore area. And this is what our focus group participants are tasked with modifying to address various concerns. And what you can see here are various shapes that are designated marine protected areas that have different levels of protection proposed. And the level of protection depends on what the underlying ecological objectives are and also how that area is used by people. So the areas in green show where full protection is proposed and therefore no extractive activities would be allowed. And that includes activities such as fishing, mining, extractive research, and also damaging activities such as dumping of waste and development. The light blue areas show the pelagic zones, and in these areas, they would prohibit activities that directly damage the seabed. So these include activities like mining, development, extractive research, but they would still allow for sustainable fishing of pelagic species at the surface. The orange areas are the seasonal closure areas, and these areas currently restrict fishing at certain times of year, and these restrictions are going to stay exactly the same. But in addition to that, these areas would also prohibit shipping and all types of development. And then the yellow area is the lobster reservoir, and this area currently prohibits lobster trapping. Again, that restriction would not change, it would stay exactly the same. But in addition to this, it would now also prohibit dredging and renewable large-scale development such as renewable energy as well. And then another major component of these proposals is in the coastal protection plan. So in this plan, you'll see fully protected areas, again, proposed in green, and these cover key shoreline areas that protect important baitfish locations, seagrass areas, and mangrove habitat. You'll also notice areas in blue, and these are areas that are within 50 meters of established mangrove habitat. So mangroves are important nursery habitat, but they also provide shoreline protection against erosion and adverse weather conditions. So the mangroves themselves are proposed to have full protection with a 10-meter full protection buffer, and then an additional 50-meter no fishing buffer on top of that. And then finally, the area in purple is an important area for seagrass and also an important area for baitfish. And so this is proposed as an area of no net fishing. And what you can see on the screen here is just a very small sample of the coastal plan, but you can see the full extent of it in the Marine Spatial Plan document, which is available on the BOP website. Okay, so most of you are probably aware of the public consultations that were held at the end of last year. And during these consultations, we asked stakeholders what they thought of the Blue Prosperity Plan. And this chart on the screen shows a breakdown of opinions from people who took our forum survey about whether they thought the proposed protection in the nearshore area adequately considers the environment and stakeholder needs. So the sections in red and blue shows those people who were in the agree range, that they thought the network as it stands does adequately consider the environment and stakeholder needs. The green area shows those who had no opinion, and the yellow shows the yellow shows those who disagree. So as you can see, at least with the nearshore network, that over a third of people who took this survey disagree that in its current form, the network doesn't adequately consider the environment and stakeholder needs. So, you know, we did get support and positive feedback from over 40%, but clearly there's some work that still needs to be done before more stakeholders are happy that the right balance has been achieved. So we then extracted this information further. We looked into this information more and we extracted the various concerns that were raised in this feedback, and we grouped them into general topics. And this was to get a better idea of where people felt the major issues were. So the graph on the screen here only includes comments made from people with concerns. It doesn't include comments from people who supported the network. And what you can see is that the comments are quite varied. So many of the concerns raised were not solely about the proposed areas of protection. We also got comments about general ocean management and the need for more enforcement. We got a lot of comments about the blue economy strategy, and also potential concerns about the potential use areas such as renewable energy. The topics that did focus on concerns around the protected area network were also quite varied. So on one end of the scale, people talked about the potential negative impacts the network might have on fishermen's livelihoods and requested less protection proposed. But then on the other end of the scale, people were concerned that there wasn't enough protection to adequately conserve the environment and would like to see more protection. And then, of course, we have concerns from people who are somewhere in the middle, concerns about the specific location or placement of MPAs and the impact that it would have on specific stakeholders or on infrastructure and utilities. So the question is, how can we modify the MPA network to better address these concerns and find a better balance between stakeholders and the environment? And this is something that we would like to work with stakeholders to try and achieve. So during the upcoming focus group, participants will be divided into 4 groups, and each group will be tasked with modifying the protected area network to address a particular area of concern. So the first group will look at how to address concerns that the complexities of fishing have not been adequately considered. So many of Bermuda's fishermen utilize different areas of the platform in different ways. They use different gear types at different times of year, and many felt that this hadn't been properly accounted for in the current proposals for protection, and that this in turn could have a big impact on the livelihoods of commercial fishermen. And an aspect of this in particular is the potential impact on the bait fishery. Many felt that this was too high, and then of course the rest of the fishing industry is dependent upon bait fishing, so this was quite important. And then also we can't forget about our recreational fishers, and many felt that the impact on recreational fishing from the rocks was too high, and this is also something that can be addressed in this particular group. The second group will attempt to address concerns that the amount of proposed protection is not adequate to fully meet the ecological objectives. So many people felt that the nearshore area is under the most pressure and should have more protection than what is currently proposed, and that top predators in particular, so species such as grouper, should be afforded more protection. and that a more data-driven approach could be used to designate protection to better achieve these ecological objectives. The third group will look at addressing where proposed protection will impact the ability to maintain critical infrastructure. So they will basically mainly be looking at where marine protected areas overlap with underwater cables, shipping lanes, docks, slips, moorings, and trying to address any potential conflict there. And then the final group will look at how the placement of MPAs could enhance tourism and address concerns that the current proposals could limit potential development opportunities, which could have large impacts on the tourism industry in particular. So this will be the opportunity for stakeholders to draw on maps and make some suggested modifications to the proposed protection. And I do just want to spend a moment to set some expectations. So just because suggestions are being submitted as part of these focus groups doesn't mean that they will definitely be incorporated into the final plans, but they will get submitted to the BOP steering committee and they will consider these suggestions when making the final MPA modifications. So obviously this is a substantial task and there are an awful lot of things that one would need to consider when making these types of modifications. So, for example, just because you're trying to make modifications to reduce impact on the fishing industry doesn't mean that you should forget about the needs of the environment. And likewise, just because you're trying to modify the network to better meet environmental needs doesn't mean you should forget about the needs of the fishing community or any other ocean stakeholders. So during these focus group sessions, we hope that participants will bring different perspectives to the table in order to find a balanced approach when trying to address the various concerns. And these are the different items in the toolbox that they will have at their disposal, that they can utilize, and that I'm going to tell you more about now. So we have general MPA concepts, we have a set of spatial objectives, we also have a list of valuable data layers or maps, and there's also a list of several potential solutions that participants can choose whether or not to adopt when modifying the MPA network. So the first item of the toolbox that I'm going to explain are the general marine protected area design concepts. So most of these concepts center around the idea of spillover. And the idea is that when you protect an area from extractive or damaging activities, you provide a refuge area for fish populations to grow and reproduce and go on to replenish other areas in an effect known as spillover. And one aspect of MPA design that can influence the amount of spillover is the size of a marine protected area. So as an MPA increases in size, generally it contains more habitats, and also the more mobile fish, those fish that can travel further, they're more likely to benefit from the protection of a larger MPA. So in general, as an MPA size increases, the benefits of spillover and also larval production also generally increase. But this comes with a caveat. So if a marine protected area becomes too large, then the benefits of spillover no longer offset the reduction in fishing grounds. So this is something to bear in mind when designing MPAs with fisheries management in mind. Okay, so while large MPAs are often better for conservation, they're not always practical when there's an active fishing industry to consider, which is the case in Bermuda. And in those instances where large MPAs are not practical, then a network of smaller MPAs can often be a good alternative. So the next concept to consider is where you put your MPA boundary. So marine protected areas that are designed specifically to conserve biodiversity should aim to encapsulate valuable habitat. This is going to provide the most opportunity for habitats to function well and for fish populations to thrive. But if the boundary covers completely encapsulates the habitat, there's less opportunity for spillover because those fish are more likely to stay within the valuable habitat. When designing MPAs with fisheries management in mind, they might benefit from having some valuable habitat inside the MPA and some outside to enhance those spillover benefits. So in this case, while the example on the right is perhaps not quite as good for biological conservation, there would be more spillover relative to the population size, which might benefit fisheries. And so it's about finding the right balance depending on what your objectives are. And then the last concept that I'd like to explain is the complexity of an MPA shape. So complex shapes have proportionally more edge compared to simple ones. So in the example that you can see on the slide, both the circle and the star have exactly the same area of 10 kilometers squared. But the star has 27 kilometers of edge compared to just 11 kilometers of edge of the circle. So the star has way more edge because it's a more complex shape. And the more edge an MPA has, the greater the chances of a fish crossing over that edge into unprotected areas. So this means that simpler shapes will be better at preserving ecological value compared to complex ones, but the complex shapes will have greater spillover relative to the population size compared to simpler shapes of the same area. So again, this is something that should be considered, and you need to think about the objectives of your area and how you're managing that area, and try to find the right balance. The other aspect to consider here is that simple shapes are also easier to enforce than complex ones, and studies show that good enforcement is necessary for marine protected areas to be effective. Okay, so the next item of the toolbox are the spatial objectives. And these are essentially a set of rules that should be followed when designing a marine protected area network in Bermuda. The spatial objectives were one of the first things to be created in the marine spatial planning process, and they've helped to guide what the proposed MPA network looks like today. And before I tell you exactly what those objectives are, I'd like to just spend a moment to tell you how they were created. So the first thing we did was that we looked at the global science. We looked at where protected areas had been implemented in other places, and we looked at what worked and what didn't. And what that science shows is that marine protected areas are most effective when you protect a variety of different habitat types, when nursery habitats are incorporated into that protection, when spawning sites are protected, and also when areas of ecological importance are protected. So these would include areas of high fish diversity, for example, or good coral cover, and other areas. We then used that information to create a set of spatial objectives or mapping objectives. And the objectives were also guided by local stakeholder input. Okay, so they went to the general public, they went to our local scientists, and they also went to focus stakeholder groups. And the stakeholders helped to finalize the drafting of these objectives, and these were what were created. So there's an objective to designate a minimum of 20% of Bermuda's EEZ as fully protected no-take MPAs, that new MPAs should consider and optimize existing legislated areas, that we should protect a representative 20% coverage of each key habitat, that we should protect 50% of juvenile fish nursery habitats. When designing marine protected areas, maintain restrictions at known fish breeding or aggregation sites. And when designing MPAs, we should prioritize to protect areas that protect valuable habitat used by unique, rare, and threatened species. We also wanted to make sure that the network takes account of how people use the ocean in an effort to reduce as much conflict as possible. So we spoke to lots of different stakeholders about how they use and value the ocean, and that resulted in additional human use objectives. So the first human use objective is about protecting areas of historical significance. So I'm sure we're all aware of how shipwrecks are linked to Bermuda's identity. You know, they're linked to myths about the Bermuda Triangle. They also act as a kind of interactive museum that demonstrates Bermuda's history and how it was settled. And they're also a very big draw for divers and tourists. So protecting these areas of historical significance was seen as something that was important, and we wanted to capture that in the spatial objectives. We also spoke to members of the fishing community about what they wanted out of this plan. So obviously, fishing provides a livelihood for many people in Bermuda, and it's also an enjoyable pastime for many others. So we wanted to make sure the objectives considered this. So we spoke to members of the fishing community, and they told us that pelagic fishing especially is important in Bermuda. So this is fishing for deeper fish species such as tuna, wahoo, mahi-mahi. These types of species account for about 50% of commercially landed species in Bermuda. And they also support the sports fishing tournaments, which is a big contributor to Bermuda's economy. So there's a spatial objective to maintain spatial continuity to the fishing for pelagic species in those deeper depths of 55 meters or more around the edge of the platform and banks. And also an additional objective that recognizes that other areas of the platform are also utilized by our fishermen. So this objective states to ensure continued access to the most highly valued fishing grounds. So these objectives, along with the ecological ones that I just explained, can basically be thought of as an instruction manual for creating Bermuda's marine protected area network. And it's an instruction manual that's been created by residents for Bermuda's waters that's also been informed by science. These are things that should be taken into account when designing and modifying Bermuda's MPA network. So the next part of the toolbox that I'd like to talk to you about are all the different maps and data layers that can be used to not only help to address concerns when modifying the MPA network, but that can also help to achieve those spatial objectives that I've just talked about. So we have a lot of different data layers available to us, and the participants of our focus groups will also have access to these layers when doing their mapping exercise to make suggested modifications to the MPA network. And as I just mentioned as well, many of these data layers are also vital to achieving the spatial objectives. So, for example, in order to protect 20% of each habitat type, as per the spatial objective, you need to know where the different habitat types are in Bermuda's waters. So in order to get this data, we put out a call to our local scientists and asked them to help us identify what Bermuda's marine environment actually looks like. And they helped us to produce a variety of maps that paint a really good picture of what Bermuda's waters actually look like. So on the screen here, you've got the different habitat zones. You've also got important areas for coral, important areas for fish, shows where the best coral cover is, where the best coral diversity, fish diversity, abundance, and much more. And we also have maps that show where the important nursery habitats are as well. You can see seagrass on the screen here, but we also have maps that show where the mangroves and the patch coral are. We also have good maps of our historic wrecks. So our custodian of historic wrecks helped us to produce this heat map. And this basically shows the abundance of historic wrecks per kilometre squared. So this gives us a much better idea of where the most significant wreck locations are so that we can incorporate them into the protected area network as per the spatial objective. We also have social science data about how the ocean is used by people. So this data was collected through the Ocean Use Survey. This was a survey that was first open to the public back in 2020. We asked all sorts of stakeholders how they use and value the ocean. We asked fishermen, boaters, divers, tourism operators, conservationists, and many, many more. And what you can see on the screen here is just an example of two heat maps from our fishing sectors, from our recreational and our commercial fishing sector, that show the most valuable areas for fishing. So the darker the red, the more valuable that area is for fishing. And I'll just explain a bit more how we collected this information so you can get a better idea of how these heat maps were created. But we basically asked respondents to draw on a map the areas of the ocean that they value the most, and then give those areas a score based on how much they valued them. So in this hypothetical example, let's say this is a fisherman drawing areas on a map of where he values the most for fishing. Now, that fisherman is given 100 value points, and he can distribute those points across the shapes however he likes. Now, this is a subjective survey, so he can value those areas in whatever way he wants. He can value them by the time he spends in an area, where he catches the most fish, where he catches the most valuable fish, ease of access. It's whatever he chooses. But if he values each of the areas the same, then he can distribute the points evenly across all the shapes. If he decides that the area in the east, for example, is more valuable than the west, then he can distribute those points accordingly. And then everybody's responses are basically collated together and layered on top of each other, and then analyzed to produce these heat maps. And what you can see here is the overall heat map from all the fishing surveys that were submitted. But these maps can be broken down further into gear type for each of the individual fisheries as well. And I'm going to explain a bit more about this later on. And then we also have a lot of data layers available on Bermuda's utilities and infrastructure. So we have maps that show where the shipping lanes are, where the underwater cables are, where the moorings are, where the shoreline infrastructure is, such as docks, marinas, boatyards, and also where buildings and roads are very close to the shoreline as well. So these maps will be particularly useful when considering how the proposed protection might impact the ability to maintain critical infrastructure. Okay, so that sums up all the major data layers that are available to help participants with this mapping exercise. I will move on to the next section now, which is to tell you about some of the potential solutions that can help resolve, or at least start to address, some of the concerns raised by stakeholders. So the BOP Steering Committee and Science Committee have discussed potential solutions to address some of the concerns that we spoke about earlier. And these solutions are something that the focus group participants can choose whether or not they want to adopt when they make their suggested modifications to the draft MPA network. So first, let's look at how we could reduce impact on the bait fishery. So Paradise Lakes, under the current proposals, is currently proposed to prohibit netting. It would be a permanent ban on netting 100 meters from the coastline around Paradise Lakes. And during the consultations, we heard that this area is very important to local fishermen, especially during the winter, and that they would really struggle to catch enough bait at this time of year if this area was closed. So the suggestion here is to remove the year-round protection against netting and instead close this area to netting during the summer months only, so from May to October inclusive. And the justification for this is that basically the bait fish spawn during the summer. So by protecting this area during the summer, you would still achieve good protection of the communities and the nursery habitat. So protecting at this time of year will still have ecological benefit, but would significantly reduce conflict. We also heard from the bait fishers that they utilize the whole coastline to catch bait. So this is particularly true in areas that are easily accessible. And the 50-meter no fishing buffer that's been placed around the mangroves is particularly problematic and could really influence the ability for them to catch bait. And this is what you can see on the maps here. So the area in green is the fully protected mangrove with a fully protected 10-meter buffer. And then the blue is the 50-meter no fishing buffer. And the suggestion here to resolve or address this concern is to remove the 50-meter no fishing buffer. And this suggestion is something that was discussed by our science committee, and they supported this change because there's been work done locally that demonstrates that juvenile fish often stay within a few meters of the mangroves. So we could still adequately protect mangroves as a nursery habitat, including the communities they support, with this buffer removed. So again, this is a solution that could significantly reduce user conflict without sacrificing a huge amount of ecological value. Next, I'd like to look at how we might be able to address some of the concerns with the shoreline stakeholders and how to reduce conflict with people who use the shoreline in different ways. So in order to address some of the feedback we've received, we need to consider how we can reduce impact on recreational shoreline fishing, so fishing from the rocks, how we can allow for the maintenance of existing shoreline infrastructure, and also how we can allow for the consideration of future shoreline development opportunities. And the suggestion in this case is to remove the full protection to 100 meters from the shoreline in these high conflict areas. And this is what that 100-meter buffer would look like in those high conflict areas. Not all of the proposed protected areas that touch the shoreline are in high conflict areas, but these are the three that have been discussed, and the areas that stakeholders have specifically expressed concerns about protection touching the shoreline. So this is what the solution would look like if the full protection was moved so it didn't start until 100 meters away from the shoreline. And again, this solution comes with a caveat. So it's important to not sacrifice too much ecological value when making this modification. So key areas that still have important nursery habitat or are still important bait fish areas would still be protected at the shoreline, but everywhere else this boundary would move further to sea so that full protection doesn't start until 100 meters out. Now, there are other ways that this solution could be modified. So the boundaries could be made simpler and straighter so that it's easier to enforce. There's also another option that instead of removing protection entirely from the shoreline, it could be replaced with a buffer of a lower level of protection. And this might make sense given that it would be in such close proximity to a fully protected MPA and therefore to ecologically valuable habitat that it might make sense for that buffer to have some restrictions without limiting them completely. And that would ensure that the fully protected MPA and the marine reserve as a whole is properly looked after. And this could also have marketing benefits as well, particularly to the tourism industry. For example, it means that we would still be able to market a marine reserve as going right up to the shoreline. So when a tourist goes to one of the popular beaches and dips their toe in the ocean, they're setting foot into a marine reserve straight away. and that can have potential benefits to various tourism-related businesses. So these are different things to consider when, considering whether or not to adopt this solution into MPA modifications. Another main concern raised, especially by those in the tourism, conservation, and science communities, is that the proposed protection isn't adequate to fully meet the ecological objectives, and there's therefore a risk that the marine protected areas won't be effective at providing the benefits that we want. And I wanted to demonstrate this visually. So what you can see on the screen here is, on the left, there are a list of habitat types, and the graph shows how much of each habitat falls within the proposed protected area network. Now, if you remember back to the spatial objectives, there's a target to protect 20% representative coverage of each habitat type. And there's also a target to protect 50% of our valuable nursery habitats. And what you can see on the screen is how the current proposals meet those habitat targets. So the green shows the amount of each habitat that falls within the proposed full protection, and the orange shows how much of each habitat falls within proposed high protection, and the red line shows the target that we're aiming for. And as you can see, it falls short on a lot of those habitats. So this is something that, modifying the MPA network, we need to consider how we can better achieve these ecological objectives. Now, the Science Committee made some suggested recommendations on where they thought should be protected in Bermuda's waters. And these recommendations are based on where our scientists felt would achieve the best ecological protection without causing too much user conflict. So this is a potentially good data layer to use that can be considered to help better achieve the ecological objectives. Now, circling back to fishing for a second. So we also heard feedback from the fishing community that the complexities involved in the commercial industry hadn't been properly considered, and that we needed to better account for how a fisherman fishes, the gear type that they use, the species that they fish, the time of year that they fish. And the way we addressed this was by reopening the Ocean Use Survey. So you might remember that the original survey was started back in 2020. But during this time, the commercial fishermen didn't provide us with the level of detail that was needed to be able to analyze the data in these complex ways. So we reopened this survey at the end of last year in order to get that level of detail. And when you look at the results together, so the graph, the map on the left, you can see that the results actually look quite similar to the original survey. It shows that all of the platform is utilized in some way, but the main difference here is that now we are much better able to split this heat map up to see all the different types of fishing. And you can see just some of the maps on the right-hand side of the screen. So you can see where the pelagic trolling happens, where the rockfish trolling happens, where trapping, bottom fishing, bait fishing happens. So we now get a much better idea of the complexities of fishing, and we can incorporate these into the modifications of the MPA network to better address this concern, and also better meet the objective of ensuring continued access to the most highly valued fishing grounds. And there were 75 commercial fishermen who took part in this survey, and this represents 38% of the industry. And this includes 29% of all part-time fishermen and 60% of all full-time fishermen. So statistically speaking, this is a really good representation for this sector. And then there's one final map that I'd like to tell you about that could help to address some of the concerns raised by our stakeholders, not just reducing fishing impact on the fishing industry, but also better achieving the ecological objectives. And this map has been produced by a computer program called the prioritization model. And what this model has done is that it's basically suggested areas for protection in a way that achieves the ecological objectives while also removing as much human impact as possible. And this is what you can see on the right-hand side of the screen with the priority areas for protection shown in green. So this prioritization model incorporates data from our local scientists about the ecology of Bermuda's waters. It also incorporates data from our local fishermen about where the most valuable fishing areas are. And just to explain a little bit about how the model works. So first of all, we tell the model what features we would like it to protect and how much. So we use the maps supplied by our science committee to tell the model, one, where the major habitat zones are, and that we want to protect 20% of each of them. We could also tell it where the best coral areas are and where the best fish areas are, and ask the model to focus protection on the most valuable of those areas. And we also told it where the nursery habitats are and asked it to protect 50% of those. We also told the model which areas to avoid protecting. So this is the next stage. So we used the Ocean Use Survey heat maps provided by our fishermen to tell the model where the most highly valuable fishing areas are, and we asked it to avoid protecting those areas. And we went a step further than that. We also told the model the most valuable areas for each of the individual fisheries. So the model knows where the most important areas are for trolling, for trapping, for bait fishing, for bottom fishing, and many more. And we asked the model to not protect too much of each type so that there would be no individual fishery that would be overly impacted by protection. And the result is this map of prioritized areas. And it's been, these areas have been decided by a computer, not by a person. So this is a data-driven, unbiased approach to spatial planning, and it incorporates data from both our local scientists and our local fishermen and aims to achieve a balance between the two, something that could be an acceptable compromise. Now, obviously, nobody is suggesting that Bermuda's marine protected area network looks identical to the green areas on this map. These shapes are far too scattered, they're far too complex, and they couldn't be properly implemented or enforced. But there may be some key areas that might be worth incorporating into the MPA network to help address concerns. And knowing that this output is trying to find a balance or a compromise between ecology and human uses, this makes it unique among the data layers that we've got access to. So the participants of our focus groups will need to decide how much value they put into this data layer and decide whether or not they want to incorporate it into their MPA modifications. So I hope that gives you a good overview of all the different considerations that need to be made when designing a marine protected area network. It is a big task and there are a lot of different things to balance. We very much look forward to seeing what our focus group participants suggest about how to modify the MPA network to address some of the concerns raised by our stakeholders. If you are also interested in seeing what these outcomes are, then please do keep an eye on our website over the coming weeks, and we'll share those outcomes with you and keep you posted. Thank you for listening.